Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are here in the Open Stage Media podcast studio once again, filming and recording at the same time another episode of Here in Schenectady, our series that takes you around the county to visit different places and tell different stories. And today we have a doozy of a story for you. We're in a time of big commemorations, right? The Erie Canal bicentennial is coming up next year. So is the 250th of the American Revolution in 2026. So we figured, why not hop on that van, on that trend, and but do something a little different this time. So Mike is going to share with us kind of a horrifying story, true crime.
It's not a fun one, folks. I hope viewer discretion is advised. I'm saying that now.
But it is from exactly 200 years ago, fall 1824. Mm-hmm. So we can imagine upstate New York in that time, drizzly, cold, gray, kind of sets the background for it.
Just like it is today, folks. You can't see, but it is a...
Well, we don't know when people are watching this, but, it is upstate New York, so it's safe to assume it's probably a little gray out there.
It's always somber in upstate New York.
So give us a little background. First of all, why are we doing true crime today? Usually we go around, we visit places, we talk about maps or archives, and today Mike was like, no, we're doing a true crime story. Yeah, so why are we talking about true crime today?
Well, partly just to satisfy my own morbid curiosity, perhaps. You see, me and my fiancé.
Congratulations.
Oh, I thank you. You heard it here first, folks. Sorry, ladies, off the market. But me and my fiancé, we listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, just kind of on our travels and whatnot. So, I don't know, it just seemed like such a natural subject of conversation. People have a grim fascination with this subject of murder and of crime. And as you're going to see, that's not some new fascination. People have always been fascinated by this kind of horrible subject matter.
Right. I'm reminded, of course, of Jack the Ripper in Victorian London, which was, the story of the day.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Even kind of today, chilling. Mm-hmm. So interesting that we kind of have our own story locally.
Yeah, it captures the imagination. And on one hand, the story that I'm about to tell you guys, well, it kind of highlights the austere society that, existed here in Schenectady at the turn of the 19th century. But while the society might be in many ways different, I think there's a certain tragic timelessness about this story. I think you're going to see a lot of resonance between the story that I'm about to tell and modern day headlines,
What do you mean by austere? You mean economically, socially? When we're looking back 200 years ago, pretty much to the day, Schenectady, what makes it austere compared to today's Schenectady?
I guess what I mean is they just they did have economically less resources, so they couldn't be quite so forgiving or permissive. They couldn't make allowances for people who might need extra allowances.
Less material wealth, a little bit more food scarcity.
Yeah, and generally speaking, they didn't know what to do with certain people, which today we might be able to better treat or medicate.
Right.
They didn't have the same medical knowledge or understanding that we had today. When someone committed some horrible, sinful act, it was treated, perhaps as a manifestation of their own sinful nature, their own, personal failings, rather than, things like the subject of mental illness, that was completely less well understood back in those days.
Well, we are historians, I guess we may be getting into armchair psychologists a little bit today.
A little bit, but I guess that kind of comes with the territory. Look, folks, I'm not trying to make any any diagnoses 200 years after the fact, but I think the story will speak for itself.
All right, so let's get into it.
Yeah, folks, this is the story, the horrible, miserable story of John Van Patten. So, it was just before noon on February 25th, 1825. We don't have a weather report from this day, but we can imagine the barren trees shaking in the blustering cold typical of winter in upstate New York. Now, despite the chill, a massive, thronging crowd had gathered at the Schenectady City Hall. In those days, the city was administered from a stately, whitewashed building on Union Street, nestled between College Street and the recently completed Erie Canal. Mary, you don't live too far from there, do you?
That building definitely doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't exist anymore. Folks, we're talking about the the Stella's parking lot right now. That's what you'd find if you went there right now. But this is where it all went down. So, now this crowd had gathered there at the former City Hall, and city officials couldn't count the number of people who had gathered, but they estimated somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people had shown up for the event, for this somber occasion. Now keep in mind, the population of Schenectady in 1825 was only about 7,000 people total.
Wow.
And there was more than the population of Schenectady
3 times
crowding the streets here at City Hall. So, many of the spectators had been waiting for hours. This had been a long-standing assembly of people. And there was somewhat of a festive mood prevailing. There was a sense of anticipation and expectation amongst the people here.
So it's kind of like giving dark summer night vibes.
Yeah, right, folks? This is how summer night got started off. It's I don't know if Smash Mouth would be in attendance, though. That was good times. Anyway. But at the designated hour, a heavy silence fell over the once festive crowd. You see, a somber young man was walking down Union Street, flanked by the city jailer. His name was John Van Patten, and he was being led to a gallows that was erected specifically for him on the lawn of the City Hall. You see, today, John was to be put to death. So, John Van Patten had no criminal record. He was not some notorious outlaw. So how did he find himself stepping up to this gallows? Nearly 200 years later, we don't have all the details, nor everyone's perspective. But the nature of John's crime created a certain media sensation for its time, immortalizing it in the collective memory of the city. John himself penned a testimonial, his Life and Confessions, which we have in our archives today. And the story as we know it is a sad one, folks. I'm going to warn you right now. On the one hand, the story sheds light on our city's austere society in the early 19th century. On the other hand, there's a certain timeless tragedy to it, which unfortunately resonates so strongly with news headlines today.
Can I ask you real quick, when we're talking about hangings in Schenectady, how common of an occurrence was this?
Well, it was not super common, and that's kind of reinforced by the fact that every time it happened, they would have to hastily assemble a gallows for the event.
Gosh, what a grim job.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, God, building the gallows or overseeing the...
all of it.
Yeah, I mean, just everything. And, it's this story, we're going to come back to the subject of that gallows. It's
okay.
It's not going to go according to plan, folks. So before this grim February day, let's rewind. Let's rewind all the way back to 1801. And that's when John Van Patten was born, not here in Schenectady, but down in New York City. And when he was about 5 years old, in 1806, his family relocated from New York City to here. And you got to imagine that's quite the contrast, right? From the bustling and burgeoning New York to the more parochial Schenectady, quaint and parochial in its nature. It was still a largely agricultural town back in those days, with vast farm fields stretching across the great flat of the Mohawk River. Now, we have no idea what brought John's parents here, but I wonder if perhaps his mother had made the move to be closer to family. You see, I think she needed the help. Unfortunately, John's father, at some point, had been declared, quote, insane, and he was unable to provide for himself or, take care of his family. He was institutionalized somewhere, somehow. We don't really know what happened to John's father, but he's really out of the picture. He's mentally ill in some way, shape, or form.
Did he have an occupation prior to being incarcerated?
I don't know that. Perhaps we could find that information, but that occupation's not going to be relevant to the story today. Because by the time that John comes to Schenectady, his father is not working. And I wonder, like I said, if maybe Mrs. Van Patten, John's mother, came here to be closer to family. Now, unfortunately, tragedy would strike early in John's life. His father is unwell, is out of the picture. His mother would die just 3 years after the move. So little 8-year-old John Van Patten is essentially, effectively orphaned. Fortunately, there are family nearby that can take care of the young boy. He goes first to his grandparents, who lived in Glenville, and then a little bit later, he moves to his uncle's residence, starts helping out on his uncle's farm down in Rotterdam. So, not exactly a happy child. Doesn't sound like a happy childhood from my perspective, though. who knows?
Were there siblings, or was he the only kid?
I don't know of any siblings. He's the only child that I am aware of. And I'll kind of preface this all by saying that a lot of this information, I'm drawing heavily from Larry Hart's treatment on the subject. And Larry Hart doesn't mention any siblings, though perhaps we could follow up on that point. So, while we're just talking about kind of mental illness at this time and how it was kind of thought of and treated, these people did not have the medical or the scientific knowledge that we have today. And so, I've heard of accounts from around this time period where these hapless people in Schenectady, they didn't know what to do with a family member who was unwell, who was perhaps a danger to themselves or to other people.
Right.
So I've heard of numerous anecdotes, not one, but numerous, where these family members would sometimes just be like chained down, like, chained to the floor or chained to a chair, so they could not move around freely and perhaps hurt themselves or hurt other people. So I don't know if that's what was happening to John's father at the time, or if that's the fate that John kind of feared for himself, because whatever the nature of this mental illness, at the time, it was known to be hereditary in John's family.
No kidding.
Yeah, passed along particularly the male side of the family.
So John's grandfather maybe also
exhibited these symptoms. Now,
Okay.
perhaps to different degrees.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of a grim prognosis, a grim, ominous foreshadowing of John's life to come. So, as John grew up, he didn't distinguish himself in any particular way. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't some notorious little punk kid terrorizing the people of Rotterdam. No, he was just as far as we can tell, a typical, average young boy. Now, as he grew up, though, he did start to exhibit symptoms of mental illness, bouts of deep and profound despair, almost to the point of, quote, feeble-mindedness. For days at a time, he would just be listless and despondent. He couldn't or wouldn't be able to do anything. And again, that's kind of how his father began to manifest his symptoms. So
Wow.
That's kind of a grim sign right there already. But with no history of violence or anything like that, nothing to disqualify him, in 1824, at this point, John is a young man. He's 23 years old. And he was appointed to be the school teacher for the small one-room school that was there in Rotterdam. So
he's literate.
He's
he
literate,
can read,
yeah.
He can write. They
Yeah,
have faith in him to teach kids this kind of thing.
Yeah, he's a pretty, respectable young man at this point in time. And there's nothing too notorious about him. And he's literate. He's educated enough that the people of Rotterdam entrusted him to look after their own kids, to educate their own kids. And it's interesting, he'd have at least one pupil that I'm aware of. If you ever recall, I talk a lot about a woman named Julia A.J. Foote.
Right. Oh, no kidding.
She was one of his students.
Wow.
She was one of his students. So this story actually had a profound impact that she mentions in her memoirs, which were written decades later. So maybe that's another story for another time, right? So John is the teacher. He's a young teacher, a young eligible bachelor, right? So for his social life, I guess John took an active interest in the religious meetings happening at the residence of one Henry Vroman Putman. I guess that's where all the young, cool singles went to mingle. They went to the religious revivals at the Putman residence. I don't know. I don't know if that's the way that I'd spend my Saturday evenings, but I don't know.
I'm feeling like there were probably gingerbread cookies.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know if they would have that communion wine there or what, but So that's the local hang for all the cool kids, and there he meets a young lady named Josanna Fonda. Now, Josanna Fonda, we don't have her perspective at any point in the story, folks. I just want to point that out here at the start. So much of what we know about this case comes from none other than the confessions of John Van Patten himself. So keep that in mind as we're talking about the rest of this case. I wish I could get Josanna's opinions on things, but we can't. But apparently, at their first meeting, Josanna and John had a little bit of a connection. And they started to, keep each other company a little bit, on a steady relationship, you might say. And in time, according to John, they promised that nothing but death should part them. Now, that's not a formal proposal. They're not engaged, but That's where John thought this relationship was
They're
going.
heading in that direction.
They're heading in that direction, or so it seems, according to John's
oh my
testimony.
gosh, okay.
All right. So John seems to be doing all right, right?
Yes.
He's got a job. He's got he's got a
girlfriend.
sweetheart.
Yeah.
So what more could a young man ask for in those days? But Josenna, she had a friend, one Mrs. Mariah. Sorry. But Josenna, she had a friend, one Mrs. Maria Skirmahorn. Now Maria, well, she was a little bit older, perhaps a little bit wiser than Josenna was. She'd been around the block. She had seen a few things, and with her experience, she decided to impart some wisdom, some advice to Josenna. You see, Maria didn't think that John was a good match at all, and she began to express this to her friend Josenna. She warned that John was sickly, he was, quote, weak-minded, and would someday be committed to an asylum just like his father. She alleged that John was a lazy teacher and that he would end his lessons early just so that he could just take off from work, that he was not really, in it for the kids. He was just in it for himself.
Maybe
really.
he's not going to be a great provider to the inevitable children.
Maybe not, and that's a genuine concern back in those days,
Yeah,
right?
course.
It's, again, resources were not abundant, food was not abundant, and, if someone couldn't be a provider, that's something you have to consider seriously when you're deciding a match or a mate for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So apparently this advice, these warnings, apparently Josenna took them to heart, and she begins to cool her relationship with John. She starts to see him less and less, and John starts picking up on that hint that maybe that relationship isn't going to blossom after all. And he hears the source of the gossip. He figures out where these allegations are coming from. So he goes and he confronts Maria too, right? He goes and talks to her about this. And, Maria, she says to him, well, if I had said anything wrong, I am sorry for it. But I'm not afraid to say what I'm obliged to. So, Maria basically sorry, but not sorry. She's sticking up for her friend.
She's standing by her words.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't think she got anything wrong.
Yeah. And unable to revive his relationship with Josenna, John fell into a deep, deep depression, worse than any he had exhibited before. And he was coming to a dark conviction.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So in his confessions, John recalls a sermon from October 3rd, 1824, which seemed to make a pretty strong impression on him, which seemed to steel his resolve to do the unthinkable. You see, he was at the North Rotterdam Church, presided by the Reverend Van Vechten at the time, and the Reverend Van Vechten was extolling his congregants, "Whatsoever thy handeth findeth to do, do with all thy might."
You said the North Rotterdam Church?
The North Rotterdam Church.
And this is Reformed, Episcopal, Presbyterian?
I would assume with the Reverend Van Vechten that it would be a Reformed church.
Okay.
Yeah. So apparently John took those words to heart. Basically, if you're going to do something, go all the way. Now, normally, folks, I think that might be good advice, but maybe not in every situation.
Not when you just got dumped.
Yeah, maybe not when you just got dumped. Maybe you should just
Cool it.
cool it, and I don't know, just be lazy and do nothing for a couple of weeks. Anyway, so the very next day, October 4th, 1824, John he lets his students out early. Well, echoing, we've heard that about him.
No surprise there.
Yeah, well, Maria, maybe she wasn't wrong after all. He dismisses his classroom early, and he walks to the Putman residence. Where he'd met Josenna.
Right.
Kind of I guess the local
party
community.
house.
Yeah, the party house, right? He goes there to borrow a gun.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he tells Mr. Putman that he's going to go squirrel shooting out in the woods. So Mr. Putman gives him a hunting piece, apparently this kind of blunderbuss-like weapon, like a shotgun, right?
Right.
So you don't have to be super accurate with a shotgun. But instead of going to the woods, instead of seeking out small critters to hunt, John goes instead to the Skirmahorn residence where Maria lived. And, he knocks on the door. He's got the gun loaded there with a double shot of black powder. And Maria, she meets him there at the door. Mr. Skirmahorn is apparently not at home. It's the middle of the day, so I'm sure Mr. Skirmahorn was actually at work, like maybe John should have been. So Maria, she meets him there at the door, and when she sees him, and when she sees that gun, she's immediately visibly frightened.
Yeah, I'm sure his face wasn't hiding.
Oh yeah, I'm
emotions.
sure he looked a little bit frightening, a little bit sketchy.
Yes.
And she picked up on that right away. Right? And she doesn't really know what to do, but she doesn't want to aggravate this young man, so she invites him into her home. she sends her children and her mother-in-law upstairs because she's kind of suspicious of his intentions, right? So whatever's going to happen, she wants to handle it herself, right? So she invites him into the parlor, and he's sitting there, and she's sitting there, and gosh, it must have felt like an interminable period of time that they're both just sitting there in the parlor. And Maria, she's trying to keep it cool, right? She's trying to talk to John, make small talk,
Diffuse the situation
as best as she can, but he's not really saying anything. He's just sitting there in a brooding silence. She's also, trying to busy herself, maybe keep, herself busy, her mind occupied, because she doesn't, like where this is going. She doesn't like the vibes, right? And so she's kind of trying to keep herself busy doing little odd jobs around the house, but she's apparently kind of moving with a frantic energy because she's so afraid for her own well-being at this point. Now, again, we don't know how long they were kind of sitting there in this purgatory, this impasse, but it must have felt like hours for the people involved. And John, at this point, insists that his resolve is starting to waver. He's starting to regret that he'd ever come here at all. And apparently several times he gets up to leave, but he stops at the door every time and figures to himself, well, gosh, at this point, they're probably going to commit me to an asylum no matter what I do. So I'm probably, whether I go through with it or not.
But he still has some plausible deniability.
He does. He does.
Could have been on his way to hunt squirrel.
Oh, yeah.
He's just acting weird.
He hasn't
really
done anything
weird.
criminal
right, exactly.
yet. But, I'm not trying to, sort through the mental gymnastics of this young man here.
He's not thinking clearly.
He's not in his right mind. No. That's for darn sure. So every time that he gets up to leave, unfortunately, he stops himself and comes right back to the frightened Maria Skirmerhorn. Now, unfortunately, after, again, who knows how long, John firms up his conviction. He steels himself. He stands up. He levels his blunderbuss right there at Maria, who's just sitting right across the room from him. And at that range, he can't miss. He fires one thunderous shot, which strikes Maria dead right there in her parlor. Yeah, and of course, well, he leaves. He leaves the house. He steps out of the house. He's walking at first, but when he hears the shrieks and the screams of terror and grief of the children and of the mother-in-law who have rushed down to the parlor to see what he had done, well, he breaks out into a run. He runs into the woods. He reloads his shotgun. That might be important for a jury later. And he has resolved that he is going to go into town and he's going to lay down his gun. He's going to deliver himself up to justice. That's what he says. But before he could do so, a posse of men assemble, and they arrest him. They seize him. They track him down. And amongst the posse is none other than Mr. Skirmerhorn, Maria's husband, who has some choice words to say to John Van Patten. Now, apparently, Mr. Skirmerhorn was able to restrain himself from doing anything physical. So they escort him to the jail. They don't tie him up. They just escort him. They walk him on into town. And he's very quickly booked into the jail and awaits his trial there. Now, the trial begins in January 12th of 1825, so we're now...
Can we just hold on for 1 second?
Yeah, sure.
Getting assassinated, getting murdered, not common.
Oh, no.
During this time period.
No. I mean, that's the thing, I mean, society was so interdependent that, these murderers, they didn't happen very often. Or at least we don't know of very many instances like this. Yeah.
This is truly a shocking event.
And it shocked the whole city, as we're going to find out. This trial, these proceedings were, even for their time, a media sensation. You can imagine sensational headlines in the Schenectady Cabinet, right, the local newspaper of the time, just kind of detailing the proceedings. Now, the trial was presided over by one Judge Durer, and the prosecution was led by District Attorney Alonzo Page. Now, that's actually a familiar name to me, Alonzo Page, husband of Harriet Mumford Bowers Page. Remember her?
The town gossip.
Oh, the town gossip, yeah, so kind of a familiar face there. Now, Van Patten was defended by Abraham Van Vechten and Henry Yates, who are some pretty well-to-do lawyers, so he's not, he's being well represented, and the defense, they don't try to contest the facts of the case. No one is saying, oh, John didn't kill Maria Skirmerhorn, it was somehow someone else. I mean, there was ample witness testimony that would, would attest to John's role here, including some pretty heartbreaking testimony from Sarah, Maria's 10-year-old daughter, who took the stand to detail what had happened. So they're not going to try to dispute that fact that John had slain Maria. Their defense, as you could probably imagine, was, they argued for insanity.
Right.
That John couldn't be held responsible for his crimes because there was this insanity that ran in his family. And his father had been committed to an asylum. So, this was, as I understand, a pretty novel legal defense for its time, right?
Okay.
Nowadays it kind of seems cliche. Oh, you do something bad, you claim insanity. But back in those days, I'm pretty sure that was still pretty new to the legal jurisprudence of the time.
We'd have to get John Gearing to weigh in on that.
I guess we do. Yeah. Now others would testify that John was not insane. He wasn't suffering some freak crime of passion. He had actually premeditated this. Some people took to the stand to testify that John was saying in the days before this horrible murder, he would say things like that he had just but one enemy in the whole world, and that soon she would be dead.
Oh my God!
So that didn't really help his case there. So after a few days of deliberations, the jury came back with a verdict. What do you think's going to happen?
I have a pretty good guess.
Well, I guess I kind of spoiled it at the start. Yeah. So a jury of John's peers came back, and they declared that he was guilty. They didn't buy his insanity defense. They didn't, that didn't cut the mustard for them. They didn't put any stock in that. They argued that whoever sheds the blood of man will have their own blood shed by man. That's the kind of turn of phrase that they used. And they also had some choice words for John as well. I'm gonna take these directly from Larry Hart's book here. So one of the jurors extolled John Van Patten here, that, but with the exception of some expressions of sorrow, which were wrung from you upon your arrest, it does not appear from the time of your perpetrating the deed to the present moment you have exhibited the feeblest mark of contrition, the slightest symptom of remorse, or the least sign even of feeling. Miserable man, can nothing soften your obdurate heart? Does it remain callous to every impression that may open it to penitence? So they didn't really seem to think that John was particularly sorry at all. Maybe they found all of his claims and his testimonial to be just self-serving.
He has no remorse, or he's not showing any remorse for what he did.
He might be saying certain things that might be calculated to show remorse, but again, the jury was not buying that for a second. So in those days, as was often the case, the sentence for the crime was death. Capital punishment was typically the sentence for murder. And so John was scheduled to be executed in February of that year. Not much time for appeals or anything like that. You see, today, a case like this would drag on for months, years probably. But
right, people sit on death row for decades.
Oh, yeah,
but in this case, it was like...
In this case, nope. Got business to do. And so this is what brings us back to that cold February day with the crowd of thousands of onlookers, most of the town of Schenectady, spectators coming from Albany and Troy, because they had heard of this sensational trial, and they wanted to see that justice be done. And so, when John approaches the gallows and that somber silence falls over the crowd...
In the Stella's parking lot.
In the Stella's parking lot. John approaches the gallows, and he walks up those steps, a good 6-7 feet. I don't know how tall the gallows was, but it's got to be at least 6 or 7 feet if it's going to accomplish its purpose, right? So those steps must feel like a mountain to climb when you know what's waiting for you at the top, right? So John gets to the top of the platform, and he stands upon the trap door above which hangs the noose. And as soon as he stands on top of that trap door, the trap door falls down underneath him, and he falls down to the ground below in a heap. And, that wasn't supposed to happen.
Right, so this is before the noose was attached.
This was before the noose was attached.
Oh, my God.
So, surprise, John. This is what it's going to feel like in a little bit. You see, again, this gallows was constructed specifically for this execution.
You're saying the city of Schenectady didn't just, have a gallows in storage.
They didn't. It was perhaps hastily cobbled together. It hadn't been tested maybe very meticulously.
Who would want to test it?
So a little bit of a botched prelude to the execution there. So then they have to pick John up, walk him back up those stairs, And he's sitting there now. Now the trapdoors, I guess they've reinforced it a little bit, so it's holding him now. And he's got to stand there on that trapdoor while, people give speeches, right? It's not just getting about the business. They have to kind of these moralizing sermons about, hey, don't kill people, folks, because this is what's going to happen to you. This will be you if you go and kill someone. Don't do it, guys. And, there'd be other people who, they wanted to give John a chance to kind of say his last words. Mm-hmm. So he took some time to thank certain people who had shown him sympathy or kindness. He also had a few, religious kind of words that he wanted to say as well. He extolled everyone in the crowd, all people, old and young, but especially the young, not to resist the Spirit of God, nor procrastinate repentance, but yield to conviction and not rest till their peace is made with God.
Yikes. You kind of hope the impressionable ears and minds in that audience weren't, looking to him for guidance.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like raises a moral dilemma, right? Can you go and do something like killing someone and then make your repentance? I mean, I don't know. We'll let the theologians hash that one out in the comments, folks. Leave your comment below. Now, the last words that John Van Patten spoke on this earth was, after all of his kind of moralizing and thank yous and whatnot, he says to the crowd that, "I am happy." And then the drop fell. And this time, there were no mistakes. The noose was tightly about his neck, and it did the deed. John Van Patten was put to death that day. And I guess after that, people just went home,
I wonder what became of Jacenna.
Jacenna Fonda.
We should look at the census records and see if did she marry someone? I mean,
we'll have to do our best.
She really dodged a bullet there.
I bet she was really thanking her lucky stars. Now it's tough though, because it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because her friend said, "Oh, John is crazy. He's going to do something crazy," and then her saying that kind of led to John doing something crazy. Not that I'm blaming Maria here.
No. I mean, she was correct.
She was correct
in her insight into John.
And I wonder, was this one inciting incident what drove him over the edge, or was it just a matter of time before he went and hurt someone?
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Who knows? It's hard to know all these years later. What a psychologist, how they would diagnose John today it kind of sounds a little bit like maybe like a manic depressive disorder. I mean, I don't know, guys. Maybe I shouldn't even speculate.
Yeah,
here.
I don't want to speculate on that. Well, there's a lot of people who have that diagnosis that aren't.
They don't go around hurting people. Right?
So. But he was definitely a profoundly ill man.
Yeah.
And it is sad.
It is sad. And, again, you hear headlines like this all the time of these kind of sad and despondent young men going and doing these horrible things. It's unfortunately something that we're still dealing with as a society today. How do you deal with people like this who everyone kind of suspects might be a danger to people, but they haven't done anything yet? I mean, we can't just go locking people up because they're sad sometimes, right? We can't just go, can we? I mean, I don't know.
I would assume that's the role of therapists and psychologists. It's to meet with those people and figure out what's the course of action?
Yeah.
How many of these people are actually dangerous and how many people are just sad?
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, gosh, it must raise some other questions as well. I mean,
is there a tombstone for Mr. Van Patten?
I don't know. I don't know where Mr. Van Patten is today.
I mean, I just have so many questions.
His mortal remains.
I have so many questions about what happened to his family after, if he was an only sibling. Does this inherited mental illness end with him?
Well,
right? He obviously didn't have any sons. Did he have brothers?
He definitely had family. Remember, he lived with his uncle for some time.
Yes. We don't know if that was maternal or paternal.
We don't. And, the Van Patten name would be a pretty, common fixture here in the Schenectady area.
Definitely.
So I don't know. He didn't have any direct descendants, but, general family members. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I would love to know in today's society how we would treat him, and would he go and ask for help? Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
If he knows his father had this affliction, and he's spending days being listless even before the whole drama with his girlfriend happened.
Yeah.
Would he be someone who would go and get help and say, I'm not doing well?
Yeah. I mean, I guess what strikes me about this is I'd like to think that today, we know better. And our medical knowledge, our scientific knowledge allows us to prevent things like this from happening.
But it doesn't.
But it doesn't seem to work all the time.
No.
And
there's
I know
always going to be cases like this that slip through.
And
I don't want to get into a whole gun control thing, right? Because that's not why we're having this. But he wasn't even a gun owner, right?
No, he just
went and borrowed one.
He just went and borrowed one from some guy, you know?
So it almost feels like there's no lesson to be learned. There's always going to be John Van Pattens out there. Which is kind of like it's a horrible note to end this on. You know,
sometimes when it comes to these somber stories, these grim stories from Schenectady's past, I don't know if this is like the right lesson to be learning here. But when you hear about all this crazy stuff happening today, you might just think that the world is going to heck. You know, it's going to heck in a handbasket.
No, it's the opposite. The more things change, the more things stay the same.
Yeah, maybe the world was always terrible, folks, and I don't know if that's reassuring or not.
But I don't think so, because the fact that this case was such a media sensation and 20,000 people came here, it, to me shows that this was rare.
It was.
This kind of thing was rare. And that almost makes me feel a little bit better, that there weren't, murderers running rampant, that it was, a big deal and scary for these people. And also, he was in custody. He wasn't a serial killer.
Not yet. Gosh, who knows? That's another question. Like, did he have other intentions? He says he was going to go turn himself in, but
yeah, I don't know. I don't think he was.
Again, that's coming from his confessions, which probably have a certain self-serving motive, or at least the threat of a self-serving motive. So.
Who knows?
Well, I guess, folks out there, if you want to learn more about this story, you could come to the Historical Society and talk to me about it. But you can also, I talked to Marietta yesterday, and I do believe she told me we have his confessions, the confessions he wrote before his execution, in our archives in the microfilm collection. Wow. So maybe you could just read the words of this infamous, notorious murderer yourself and come to your own conclusions.
Sounds good. And might we expect more true crime from you in the future?
Well, I guess that depends on our audience. Folks, if you like this format, if you like this grim subject, well, feel free to let us know. Send us an email, leave a comment below this video. This should be going up on our YouTube page in a little bit here. So feedback always helps us, guys. If there are subjects or topics that you want to learn more about, we're always happy to oblige, and we're always happy to work with the folks here at Open Stage Media who make these podcasts, gosh, so easy and so polished and professional. Yeah, big shout out to the guys at Open Stage Media for today.
And so on that note, one thing is for sure, we will be back with another episode of Here in Schenectady.
Absolutely.
At some point in the near future, either here in the studio or out on the streets of Schenectady County. And thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks, folks. Have a good one.